So we're less than 30 minutes away from day 2 of Derek Chauvin's trial getting underway. As we've mentioned, the trial began yesterday with statements, testimony, and disturbing video. Chauvin is charged with killing George Floyd last May. Skyler Henry joins us now with more on what's happening on the ground in Minneapolis. Skyler, hey, thanks for joining us again. It's day 2 of the trial. What are we likely to expect from today?
Right, so we will hear from Donald Williams, Anne-Marie. He's going to pick up where he left off yesterday with his compelling testimony. He was one of the bystanders who was actually there when the incident between Derek Chauvin and George Floyd began. Actually, there's a little housekeeping that the judge had to do in this case. He had to rule that in this testimony of the 4 people that we are expected to hear from who are under the age of 18, we will actually see the broadcast only, but not video. He's doing so to actually protect their identities to an extent. Their names will be read for the record inside of the courtroom, but they will not be broadcast out there, given the sensitivity and high-profile nature of this case. But in terms of testimony, as I said before, we will continue to hear from Donald Williams. He's actually a former pro wrestler who said that he watched as the eyes of George Floyd started to roll to the back of his head. He also made mention of the fact that he watched as he took his final breaths before he became unconscious. And so he's expected to be cross-examined by the defense as well. But for the prosecution, he was actually speaking to how he tried to step in at multiple points, speaking to Derek Chauvin, saying that, hey, what you are doing is actually going to kill George Floyd. Chauvin made brief eye contact with him, but then proceeded on with the restraint that he was doing to George Floyd.
So, Skyler, are you hearing anything on the ground from the community and activists after Monday's proceedings? I note that things are relatively calm there.
Yeah, pardon it, it's a little windy out here, but so essentially what we've been seeing since we've been here for the last 3 or so days are consistent rallies that are happening around the courthouse. Not nearly as unrest like what we saw last year, more so peaceful, but all of them calling for justice for George Floyd. There's signage around the courthouse as well, attached to fencing and everything else. We also saw many people out in the wee hours of the morning this morning, making sure that their voices were heard, just to try to say that what they feel as though happened to George Floyd simply cannot happen again. They're expected to come back out here a little later on today. We saw a few folks with signs out saying that they will be back, but this is a bigger conversation. One of our local affiliates had conversations with some of the restaurants and businesses in this area. Certainly tense right now. They remember what this situation was 10 months ago, where they had to board up their windows and doors because of the possible unrest, the possible damage, and the possible fallout that they may have seen from what happened with George Floyd. And so a lot of people waiting on pins and needles, if you will, Vlad, to see what happens in this trial, especially as it moves in the final weeks in terms of a closing argument and they reach a verdict.
You know, we saw yesterday before the trial started that George Floyd's family and supporters, attorneys all gathered in front of the courthouse. They kind of had a moment of silence, yeah. The length of time that the officer's knee was on George Floyd's neck. What are they asking for? What do they want to see happen? I know it seems like a simple question. Obviously, they want a conviction, but what are demonstrators saying, beyond the conviction, they need to see happen here?
Well, I'll give you a good example of that, Anne-Marie. We actually caught up with the mother of Eric Garner, and you'll remember he was the man who was killed by a New York police officer back in 2014. He was the person who, the phrase "I can't breathe," that actually became a national rallying cry for instances of police brutality, or where people feel as though that were the case. Well, we spoke with his mother. She told me that many times families go into situations like this and don't walk away with justice, and that she was hoping that this case, given its national exposure and really international exposure, that something does change. Obviously, the city of Minneapolis, all eyes of the world really on that courtroom behind me to see what is going to happen. Many people calling for justice, which, you know, that's something that we've heard throughout this entire time, but really they're also calling for a conversation and rallying around the idea of policing in terms of communities of color and the relationship that the two have going forward, and whether or not there's appropriate uses of force, whether or not people should go out into the community if they aren't properly trained to do so. And so there are a lot of ripple effects in terms of conversations that people want to see happen even long after this verdict comes in this case. But I think it all starts with what happens inside of that courtroom.
So, Skyler, I don't have to tell you this. As you know, the Derek Chauvin trial represents a defining moment for this country. Does the city of Minneapolis have a plan in place for when the jury reaches a verdict? I mean, this is becoming a referendum on so many things, and it perhaps shouldn't be, but it is. It's just a reality of where we are today. It encompasses everything from policing in America to what it's like to be a black person walking the streets of our cities. So what are you hearing from officials?
Right. Well, let's set the scene, if you will. So the government center right behind me, the Hennepin County Government Center, is essentially fortified. It's closed to the public. It's surrounded by fences, concrete barriers. There's National Guards men and women outside, as well as an increased level of police presence just to make sure that everyone inside who's doing the job of making sure that this trial goes through is as safe as possible. And really, you start to feel that even as you move further out in and around the city. Well, the city is anticipating that that will be the case. And I made mention of a few of those businesses who are, worried, to say the least, that something that we saw last May may happen again. They're contemplating whether they want to board up their businesses and things like that. And so a lot of people on pins and needles, as I said before. But the city of Minneapolis putting millions of dollars to invest in terms of to make sure that everyone is as safe and secure as possible in this case. We also know that the city is also mulling over the idea of considering how they do policing here in Minneapolis. And so that is something else that you have to take away of just what happened here last May. So as I said before, a lot of different moving parts coming from this. I think many people hopeful for a just outcome, whether that's Derek Chauvin being convicted in this case or on what specific charges, where he can, be facing prison time anywhere from 10 to 40 years in prison. But what they're looking for is more so long-term solutions long after this, Vlad.
All right, Skyler Henry reporting for us on the ground in Minneapolis. Skyler, thank you, my friend.